China promises to buy billions of euros of European debt to keep the euro alive. With Europe running a huge trade deficit with China, does Beijing have the upper hand? Why is Europe welcoming China's support now? And who needs who the most? This is Inside Story. Hello, a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem Seeker. Trust China. That's the message for Europe from the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao. He's on a 5-day tour of the continent, visiting Britain and Germany, but his first stop was Hungary. The Chinese leader is pledging his country's support for the Eurozone, now stuck in a deepening debt crisis. He's now promising to open up China's markets to British products. Lawrence Lee reports on Wen Jiabao's visit to London.
Britain's a country not used to having to act in a subservient way. But China's now so important economically that they get the red carpet treatment. The British Prime Minister and the Chinese Premier have much more in common than might appear, and the trumpeting that accompanied a billion-dollar trade deal is more significant than the actual sum suggests. Trade deals like this are important for both countries, but for completely different reasons. Britain can't grow its economy at home as it might like to, and so has embarked instead on a massive austerity programme. China, by contrast, can't continue to grow at the enormous rate it has done if consumers in countries like Britain don't have enough money to spend on goods that China produces at home. So it's come to pass in recent years that a totemic car brand made famous when Britain was an industrial power is now owned by China. Britain, which can't compete in manufacturing, is now being offered the chance to export pigs and chickens to China and advise on things like environmental concerns. Still, if it makes Britain feel a little less than significant in the new economic world order, they weren't showing it.
Some economies like Germany have a larger share in manufacturing, and we want to grow our manufacturing. But one of Britain's strengths is in areas like pharmaceuticals, insurance, retail, banking, many of the service industries, which actually tend to grow in exports as economies open up and develop.
This economic reality also means it's much easier for China to face down protests and complaints about human rights with the kind of confidence that can only come from so much influence.
I agree with Prime Minister Cameron that the ideas of human rights, democracy, freedom and equality have immensely emancipated human mind. Yet, different countries and societies may realize these ideas in different ways and forms.
After this, the Chinese delegation heads to Germany to discuss what China can do to shore up the Eurozone, which is under something approaching existential threat. With Chinese economic domination over Europe set to continue, British school children would be well advised to start learning Mandarin. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, the Chinese Premier offered his country's support for Europe and its common currency amid the Eurozone's debt crisis. He said China will consistently support Europe and the euro. Europe's debt crisis is expanding, and trust is more important than currency and gold now. During the debt crisis, we again bring trust to Europe. Immediately, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban welcomed the Chinese offer. He said this is a historical aid from China, helping us to go down the economic development path we were planning to take. So what lies behind China's apparent faith in Europe and its single currency? Well, for years, China has been buying government bonds right across the world, and its foreign currency reserves are now worth more than $3 trillion. It holds hundreds of billions of dollars in bonds from the troubled Greek, Portuguese and Spanish economies. The reason it's buying the debt is that the Eurozone is now its biggest economic partner, with trade worth nearly $573 billion. For that reason, China has made it clear it wants to keep the euro strong. Well, joining me now to talk more about this are our guests. In Brussels, Jonathan Holslag, Head of Research at the Brussels Institute of Contemporary China Studies. In Zurich, Jan Randolph, Head of Sovereign Risk at IHS Global Insight. And in Hong Kong, Lok Sang Ho, a Professor of Economics at Linglang University. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Jan Randolph, if I could start with you. What is China looking to do here? And is this a relationship that Europe will ultimately benefit from?
Yes, I think so. However you look at it, the only real growth in Europe is coming from Germany, and a lot of that growth is down to exports to China. At the same time, the European Union as a whole is the biggest export market for China. So they want to see recovery. They want to see a solution or a better management of the Eurozone debt crisis. And they play a very important supporting role there. I mean, they're sitting on $3 trillion, and they simply don't want the dollar to be the only game in town when it comes to parking their hundreds of billions of dollars. So they are prepared to look at European debt markets, and they have a very important supporting role in that.
Lok Sang-ho, if I could turn to you on this, what's your take on this? Are China and Europe rivals, or are they partners?
I see China as a huge market for Europe, especially given the fact that in China the savings rate is still very, very low, which means that there's a lot of potential for, the savings rate is extremely high, which means that there's a lot of potential for the Chinese market to grow. And in recent years, the leadership in China has been very keen on increasing imports, and that is, of course, will relieve the pressure for the renminbi to appreciate. And I think China and Europe are partners in this sense.
Jonathan Holslag, I know you believe that what China is basically engaging in here is what you call economic nationalism. Just to elaborate on that a bit more for us, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think indeed that there is a lot of potential in the EU-China relations, but China is clearly pursuing its relations with Europe from a very strategic point of view. As my colleagues have already pointed out, it has a huge interest in keeping the European consumer market afloat. It wants to diversify its holds of currency reserves, but it also sees the current financial crisis as a window of opportunity to get in with its companies, to purchase famous brands, to get hold of sensitive and important intellectual property and know-how. So it's a combination of, I would say, political ends and commercial aspirations.
Jan Randolph, there's no doubt that both China and Europe are getting something out of this relationship, but we asked this question at the top of the program. Who's getting the most out of this? Who needs who the most?
To be honest, they both need each other, and increasingly more so. It really is a game that both can win. You can debate about who's got a slightly more advantage, but really, Europe will need China. The name of the game in advanced globalization for advanced economies is really selling back to these strongly growing emerging markets. Germany's demonstrated that it can do that very successfully. It's the only economy truly out of recession and really into recovery, and it's taking a lot of other economies with it around it. For the Chinese, though, they really see Europe both as an export market, and they're looking to invest on the ground. They've done so in Paris, Athens. They're laying the railway lines, if you like, for future exports as well as current exports. So there's a lot of win-win opportunity here, and they don't want the Eurozone to collapse. It would affect them hard. As I said, they're sitting on hundreds of billions, and they don't want the dollar to be the only game in town. They want European debt markets as well.
Well, you talk about the export markets that Europe offers to China. I mean, these are troubled times in Europe at the moment with massive debts hanging over many nations. Is that something that China is going to be worried about as well, its future market?
Well, yes, but China can also invest on the ground, and that's very important for retooling an economy, particularly the southern European economies. They need direct investment as well as investment in debt markets, and they're doing that. They're investing in ports and infrastructure, and this is new investment. This is it raises employment in these economies. It brings in new technologies, and for China, it's like laying the old railway lines into your export markets, for future Chinese exports. So there's a win-win situation here.
Jonathan Holslag, is it entirely win-win here? I mean, with Europe's current economic problems and its huge trade deficit with China and the debt crisis that I mentioned earlier, do the Chinese have the upper hand?
Well, I think there is certainly mutual dependence, but I wouldn't exaggerate China's economic presence at the moment in Europe. If you look at the inflows of investment, it only amounts to, according to Chinese government figures, $6 billion, which is really not a lot. If we compare China's holding of sovereign bonds, European sovereign bonds, it's almost peanuts compared to the $1 billion plus US dollars in treasury bond holdings. So it's still very much at the beginning. And when it comes to reciprocity, to mutually beneficial collaborations, I think there are still a lot of thorny issues out of there. A lot of European companies complain increasingly about the extent of access that they have to the Chinese consumer market, and to the degree about which can actually also reap profits from China's burgeoning economy.
Lok Sang-ho, from where you sit in Hong Kong, what do you believe China is getting out of this relationship, closer ties with Europe, given that, as we already mentioned, much of its economic stake right now is with the United States?
Yeah, I think China's overseas investment is actually rising quite fast, even though it started off with a very small base. And China is looking forward to investing a lot more in the next few years, and Europe is one of the key destinations. Obviously, China does not want to put too much weight on the U.S. alone, especially given the fact that the U.S. and China are now in some kind of conflict to some extent, because the U.S. has been giving support to Philippines and Vietnam over the territorial issue in the South China Sea. And I think China really wants to put a bit more pressure on the U.S. at this time. And by befriending with Europe, China will play with Europe against the U.S.
But what about China's exposure to, if I could turn back to you on this, Lok Sang-ho in Hong Kong, what about China's exposure to countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain, the hundreds of billions of dollars that they hold in bonds from those countries? Is that something that China is going to be worried about?
Well, actually, China wants to tell Europe that that China is a friend, and China does not worry too much about the problem in Greece and in Portugal, because these are actually relatively small countries. Of course, there's a bigger problem in Spain, if the Spanish problem gets more serious. But in terms of the total amount of debt that's outstanding, which China can purchase, actually it is still a relatively small percentage of its entire portfolio. So I don't think China is worried too much.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more about the human rights issue in this discussion and China's record on that. I know none of you are politicians, but this is clearly an issue that always comes up in any discussions involving China and other countries. Jan Randolph, you can't simply brush this human rights issue under the carpet, can you?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I often find that the Chinese politicians, when they do talk about human rights, they talk about different kind of human rights. They think in terms of development rights, freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, freedom from poverty, rather than the more liberal rights that Westerners talk about, freedom of speech, freedom to set up your own party. So they often talk past each other, but the Chinese way of looking at it is development is the lingering truth here, and the faster we grow, the more opportunities we give our citizens to transform their lives. They think they're actually improving human rights, and in the process, they're giving people opportunities to improve themselves through jobs, and they see that as more fundamental than freedom of speech, for example, or setting up your own political party.
Jonathan Holslag, any European countries, Western nations particularly, are always going to bring up this issue of China's human rights record in any discussion with Chinese officials behind closed doors, of course. But given the very mutual beneficial relationship between the two, and given all of the economic problems in Europe at the moment, they don't want to they don't want to harp too much on this, do they? They don't want to risk biting the hand that feeds them.
Well, it's rather ambivalent. It's true that European political leaders are rather cautious when they nowadays lecture China on human rights. It's also true that among some elites here in Europe, the Chinese have gained a bit credit for advancing social and economic human rights. But on the other hand, we also see that in policy dialogues with China at level of the European Commission, but also member states, the human rights issues are still very much on the agenda. And I think what's even more, a lot of European societies increasingly feel the heat of the Chinese economy in terms of competition, are afraid for their jobs. And nowadays we see that the human rights issue, that the issue of social standards and so on, is emerging as a sort of argument, a justification, if you want, for pursuing a more assertive trade agenda towards China. So I wouldn't really say that Europe is going to brush aside human rights issues. I think they might boil up at some stage in a more defensive agenda towards the People's Republic of China if Europe continues to slide into a crisis of inconfidence.
Your view on this, Professor Locke, does the human rights issue risk getting buried under all of these economic issues, especially given the reality of economic austerity in Europe at the moment?
Yes, I think in Europe there's a very active civil society. And I think the various civil society organizations are very active, and they are still very vocal, and they will speak out against Chinese abuse of human rights. But on the other hand, I must say that Premier Wen Jiabao has been very much concerned about certain possible abuses of rights by local officials. In terms of corruption and some other problems. And in the recent speech, Wen Jiabao explicitly mentioned that corruption and runaway inflation could endanger the regime. So obviously the Chinese leadership is very much concerned about some of these other issues about abuses. But certainly at the same time, it does not want to be under any threat in terms of its leadership. So I think that is paramount. But other than that, I think China is going to be a bit more liberal in the years to come, as long as it doesn't really affect its leadership.
And what are some of the challenges, do you think, that China has in its dealings with Europe, Professor Locke, in terms of its government structure? Because we're talking about a 27-nation bloc here. All of them don't always speak with one voice. There are 27 countries, all with different governments and different policies. How much of a challenge is that for China?
Well, as I said, in terms of human rights, I think the governments are going to let the civil society speak out. Just like in a recent case, like the Nobel Prize that was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, the governments are saying that, well, this is entirely out of our hands. It doesn't have anything to do with with the award of that prize, and it's not going to intervene. So I think on the government side, they are going to continue to be friends, but in the civil society, there will continue to be a lot of voice. And I don't think this is going to cause too much of a problem. Actually, to further the cause of democracy, more dialogue is always better than less dialogue. So I think this kind of more integration in terms of trade will actually serve the purpose to some extent.
Jan Randolph, if I turn back to you on this, does it serve Europe's interests better if they're all talking with one voice rather than the voice of lots of different nations who have their various disagreements? I mean, the benefit that China has with dealing with the US, its biggest trading partner, is it knows whatever differences they may have, they know who they're dealing with. They're dealing with one government in Washington. With Europe, that's not always the case, is it?
Yeah, you're right. And sometimes other countries like Russia take advantage of the different voices that sometimes appear in Europe. That's one reason why we recently have a new post as president and foreign minister. So where Moscow, Beijing, and Washington know who to call in a crisis. We have a president of the EU, and we have a foreign minister for the EU. But besides that, it's a lot more difficult. I mean, we're talking about a collection of countries, and they've built this system. It is a union, a pooling of sovereignty, but it doesn't go all the way like it does it goes much further in the US, of course. And it can be problematic in terms of coming to a common position on things, even on the issue of how to use the point about human rights that all in Europe can agree to. How far that can be used for example, in trade negotiations. There's disagreement about that.
Jonathan Holslag, various disagreements within European nations. It is a union up to a point, as Jan Randolph says, but going forward, as the potential trade with China increases in the future, is that going to be more of a challenge?
Well, I think we are a region, not a nation state, and it's logical that there are fault lines and that these fault lines are often exacerbated and widened at times of crisis. But I don't really believe that the European Union is in disarray. If we look at, for instance, our trade policy, I think there is actually more coherence since a few years now that the European Commission has a stronger mandate to negotiate with China about issues ranging from trade over investment to IPR. And the Chinese understand that, and you see that as a consequence of that evolution, they are trying to exploit more actively the internal divisions among member states. But what is quite curious, and I think that deserves some attention, is that even the member states who are reaching out the most actively towards Beijing to attract investment and financial aid are fairly supportive of a more robust trade agenda towards China, and even an industrial policy that in the future has to defend our own manufacturing sector to emerging powers like China. So it's not that simple that Europe is falling apart in the light of all sorts of business promises from the East.
Jan Randolph, as we mentioned at the top there, the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao is also heading to Germany to discuss many of the same economic issues. What is at stake with Germany, given that it is by far Europe's largest economy?
Yeah, it's Europe's largest economy. It's the only one that's really recovered and has a lot of influence economically, lifting other Eurozone countries into recovery. But I think most important, when you look at Europe and ask yourself, what are the two most powerful institutions in the European Union? You've got the ECB, European Central Bank, but the other one is the Berlin government. So, really a solution to any kind of solution or better management to the debt crisis will have to involve Berlin government. They are the most important key player, the biggest paymaster to the Eurozone and the European Union, and they're very much in the driving seat, unashamedly so now. Really, if you want to find out what's going to happen to Europe and the European Union and the debt crisis, you have to ask Berlin.
And would Berlin welcome China's support in terms of propping up countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain?
Absolutely. I think we have to get it in perspective, though. A lot of European government debt is held by European banks. Full stop. Unlike America, where a lot of the debt is held by Beijing and other Asians and Middle Eastern countries. Europe is very much held. European debt, sovereign debt, is held by and large by European governments, although there's some crossover within the Eurozone. The amount that China holds is very small, but it can be very important. They can act as a very important supporting role here. They certainly have taken interest in some of these Euro bonds that help finance the bailout facility. That's got the backing of the AAA countries like Germany, France and Holland. They're quite happy to invest there as an alternative to US bond markets.
All right, it's been a fascinating discussion, gentlemen, but we are unfortunately out of time. But I want to thank all three of our guests for taking part. Jonathan Holslag in Brussels, Jan Randolph in Zurich and Lok Sang Ho in Hong Kong. Gentlemen, many thanks for your time. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Remember, you can email them to us anytime at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.